The two other facts which I know, and she will tell us the rest, is that I think apart from Yelena, Svetlana was the only Russian presenter in Tokyo at the latest 4S meeting, meaning that the social studies.
Right. I didn't make, well, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And the last thing she told me yesterday, which I think adds a very nice touch, she is originally from Stalingrad, meaning from Volgograd, so we expect a nice fight.
Yeah. So, hello everyone, I'm Sветlana Mиляева. Is that, could I have it?
Okay.
Yes, all right. And at the moment I'm affiliated with Edinburgh University, where I completed my PhD in 2009. The title of my work today has three parts in it. The first part is the legal making, the second part material markets, and the third part is currency derivatives. So now I'm at even more complexity to that. It's not just any abstract legal making I'm going to discuss, it's a very particular law, the Article 1062 of the Russian Civil Code. And then it's not just any currency derivatives also, it's a very particular type of derivative, which is a cash-settled forward, which are traded over the counter, which means by direct negotiations between banks.
And what's that in Russian? Any chance?
Sorry?
What's that in Russian?
Сейчас скажу. In Russian it's расчетные форвардные контракты.
Понятно. В общем, доклад про расчетные форвардные контракты, Гражданский кодекс.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. So as I said, these cash-settled forwards, they are traded over the counter, which means by direct negotiations between banks rather than on exchange. And the currency pair I'm going to discuss is the US dollar and Russian ruble. As for the material markets, well, actually that's the whole point of my talk, because that's my argument, that's the argument I'm going to make. So now, why am I here? I am not an STS scholar, and I don't have an STS background, unfortunately. I am a sociologist, but with a very particular interest in financial markets. And this interest in financial markets is what makes me to be considered a researcher that belongs to a very particular field, which is social studies of finance, or SSF. So to be able to explain what that field is, let me use the quote of Bruno Latour from his most recent book, which is The Making of Law. The book was published in 2009, and in this book he reminds us that science and technology studies evolved to revise our thinking about what sort of strange beast lived in the West under the name of objective science. And we soon realized that there was no much connection between universal science and the otherwise fascinating anthropological reality of Western science. So science doesn't mirror epistemology. Well, likewise, financial markets perhaps does not mirror economic theory. Financial markets perhaps bear no more resemblance to economic theory than science does to epistemology. Well, actually, one of the most interesting developments in science, social studies of finance, is the performativity of economics, where Donald Mackenzie argues that economics as an academic discipline also performs markets rather than simply describes them. For example, in his research, he reveals the very important role, crucial role of financial theory, and in particular the theory of options that played in the transformation of global financial markets. So there is also another insight that social studies of finance borrows from science and technology studies, and that insight is that small technicalities can turn into global issues, macro issues. In other words, scales are not stable, and this is one of the presets of the social studies of finance. So in this tradition of science and technology study, I argue that the tiny legal technicality that appeared in the Russian default in 1998 is fascinating and matters a lot because it played a very important role in the chain of events that finally resulted in the most recent financial crisis. So this is precisely why I focus on the application of a particular article of the Russian Civil Code to cash-settled derivatives. And this micro-issue, micro-phenomenon, I believe has become quite large. So my case study is a very particular market. It's a currency derivatives market. And this currency derivative market is a part of a large global financial derivatives market. And actually to say large about this market means to say nothing because its size is enormous. I use the statistics of the Bank for International Settlements. And despite the most current economic crisis and the ongoing recession, the market grew to $601 trillion in 2010. So to appreciate this sum, it's about 53,000 pounds or 2.5 million rubles for every human being on earth. And yet the market seems to be quite an abstract web of global transactions. So where do we place this market? Well, currency or foreign exchange market, foreign exchange contracts are traded mainly over the counter, as I said, which is direct dealings between, for example, banks. And somehow this market, by and large, seems to be quite virtual. And by virtual, I mean two things. The first thing is the rapid expansion of electronic trading and its market on screens. Here, for example, the screenshot that was kindly provided one of my interviewees, a broker in London, and this screen, like any other interbank broker screens, is not publicly available. So this is the electronic broking service EBS spot dealing system, which is used in currency trading. So as I said, by high virtuality of derivatives, I mean the predominance of electronic trading or trading on screens. But there is also another aspect that makes financial derivatives quite highly virtual. So what is a derivative? Of course, there are quite a few definitions of derivatives, of quite many types of derivatives, but I'm going to discuss just one type, which is a currency forward. So a currency forward is an agreement to buy or to sell a particular currency at a certain price on a certain day in the future. So it is a contract that traded between banks, but banks also trade them on behalf of their clients or investment funds, etc. But it's not just the foreign exchange trade where you could buy a certain amount of rubles for a certain amount of dollars today, or as they say, on spot. The word forward actually explains the contract, which means that you will use today's exchange rate, for example, as of 19th of November, but rubles will be delivered to you in the month's time on the 19th of December, if it's a month's contract. But there are also 3 months contracts or 6 months contracts, etc. So the exchange rate is fixed for you for this month. But there are physically settled and cash settled forwards. And physically settled or deliverable forwards, you will get your money in a month's time for the price that you've agreed on. In cash settled forwards, in a month's time, instead of transferring the money, you simply check the current exchange rate as of the 19th of December, and you just pay the difference between this current exchange rate and the contracted rate. So virtuality of this agreement becomes even more striking if it's by itself, it's just a promise to buy or to sell. But on the top of it, it becomes even more striking when there is nothing actually will be bought or sold, well, technically speaking. Now, why would you buy non-deliverable forward, or why would you want to buy a contract that is not designed to transfer the currency? Well, because global banks want to hedge the risk or ensure against the exchange rate fluctuations, so to prevent possible losses. So here's what another of my interviewee, another broker in London said, that from a management point of view, it's good because settlement risk is less, the money is not kicked about. And if you aim at hedging market risk, then you simply need to get an equivalent of this very market risk. Fair enough. However, there was another reason for buying these non-deliverable forwards back in 1999. Back then, the trade between international bank and Russian banks, the so-called cross-border market, had very large volumes. And because the so-called GKOs, short-term government bonds, that were highly profitable at that time to invest in with 120% interest rate. But according to the Russian law, global banks had to use Russian currency to be able to buy these GKOs or short-term bonds because of the convertibility issue under the Russian law. So to fix the price of ruble or to hedge the currency risk, the global banks were buying non-deliverable forwards from Russian banks. But for a number of reasons, the foreign capital started outflowing from Russia in spring of 1998. That means that the banks started massive sales of GKOs and the repatriation of the capital. This provoked the surge in demand in US dollars, the escalation of US dollar spot price, and depreciation of ruble. So the exchange rate in August 1998 went up from 6 rubles for $1 to 16 rubles for the same $1. Obviously, Russian banks could not execute the forward contracts that demanded 3 times more expensive dollars, and they defaulted on the forward obligations. And big global banks, for example, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, or JP Morgan, they exited the market bearing very heavy losses. And what is most important in this story is that it's a common view that the global banks bore those losses from restructuring GKOs. But here, what Konstantin Karichenko, who at that time was the head of Open Market Operations Department at the Bank of Russia, Central Bank of Russia, admitted 10 years later in 2008, saying that the gain or losses from restructuring of GKOs were appallingly less than gain and losses in the forward market, and that is why all the problems seen as foreign investors' GKO troubles were in fact the forward troubles. Now, the global banks had been trading the currency forwards for a very simple reason. They were attracted by high profits in GKOs and presumably helpful cash settlements of the non-deliverable forwards. However, this advantage of the cash settlement turned out to be quite a peculiar thing. It comes particularly handy when there is not, the item of the contract cannot be delivered, for example, an interest rate or financial index. This looks like a great solution for financial derivatives, but it's also a dangerous one, because if there are no delivery, these contracts might be seen as gambling. And gambling is a financial activity which is not legally enforceable, and which means that the party of this contract, non-deliverable contract, are in the business at their own account. So this issue of gambling is a recurrent problem for financial derivatives, and across the world legal systems are very hostile to gambling, and this is precisely why financial derivatives has not been recognized as sound, legally enforceable and respectable activities at once, instantly. There's been very interesting research done by Marike de Gude in 2005 on that, and also the Donald Mackenzie and Yuval Miller published a paper in 2003 in the American Journal of Sociology, where they gave absolutely fascinating account on how the same legal uncertainty caused the delay in the introduction of index futures in 1970s in the US. So the same gambling issue reappeared here in Russia back in 1998. Global banks could not recover their money from Russian banks because these litigation battles that followed the crisis resulted in Russian arbitration courts declaring those contracts void. Without the physical delivery, the courts classified those contracts as bets and therefore referred to this article 1062 of Russian Civil Code, which says that the claims of citizens and legal entities connected with the organization of games and betting or participation therein shall not be subject to judicial enforcement. So the message from the Russian legal system or the application of this article to the forwards meant 3 things. A first thing is there was no way to recover the money for global banks. And this legal message provoked the so-called a flight to quality, which means that global banks, to cover the losses that global banks and hedge funds preferred financial assets that were safe. And because of its not so safe portfolio, the hedge fund, which was called the long-term capital management, suffered most, and it went bankrupt in September 1998. The collapse of this hedge fund made the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, because this hedge fund was far too big to fail unassisted, because quite a few American banks actually been linked to that bank. And low interest rates restored financial confidence, but they also produced what is now called bubbles, the dot-com bubble and housing bubble. And the result of the housing bubble is well known to us all. It's the most recent financial crisis and the ongoing recession and the current Eurozone debt crisis. So the scales are not stable indeed. This tiny technicality, the application of this article of Russian Civil Code to non-deliverable forwards was a link in this chain of events that eventually led to the most recent financial crisis. Now, the second consequence of the same application was that this is the forward market after the crisis, after 1998. So global banks kept trading these forwards with each other offshore under British law. Most of the trade was and still is in London. Russian banks simply stopped trading such contracts, and the cross-border trade between Russian banks and London banks almost disappeared. So, as you can see, the market became quite segmented. And what's wrong with this segmentation? As economists would know, the segmentation results in the lack of liquidity. And the lack of liquidity means that without widely recognized legal protection, global banks are simply not interested in trading these contracts. And the more difficulties in hedging Russian currency, obviously the less investment capital goes into the Russian economy. And finally, the third consequence of the application of this article to the forward contracts. Banks that trade over the counter normally enter not normally, but obviously enter not in just one contract, but produce a myriad of different derivative obligations transactions, both cash settled and physically delivered. As a rule, all interbank transactions are covered by so-called master agreements, which is a standardized contract that assembles various types of derivatives traded between banks into one agreement. So the comprehensive structure of these agreements makes it possible to reduce all outstanding obligations to just one final sum. For example, a very basic example here. Dresdner Bank is under the obligation to pay BNP Paribas $300,000, and BNP Paribas owes Dresdner $100,000. So the final sum, which should be paid, is $200,000. Now, if cash-settled contracts are not legally enforceable, that means that this agreement, master agreement, cannot work. So netting is not possible, but it's a risk management tool, and the importance of this risk management tool was demonstrated during the latest financial crisis. The web of sophisticated derivatives transactions between global banks is so complex that without the netting it's not possible to sort out the obligations between banks. So of all of these three consequences, unfortunately we cannot reverse the financial crisis, but to enable netting and make the forward contract, market liquid again, it would be logical to make these cash settled forwards enforceable under the Russian law. So the talks began in 2000, but it took 7 years to make these contracts enforceable. And the Civil Code has been amended in a way that this article 1062 got few more words confirming that forwards are not bets. Why did it take so long? Because this tiny legal technicality is quite a complex matter. For example, it involves politics that is shaped by the conflict of regulators, and in this case, the regulators is the Central Bank of Russia and the Federal Financial Market Service. Because of the overlap in the areas they control, both of these authorities can initiate legal changes, and that's what they did, but the changes were different. The central bank favored the legal project that promoted the so-called law on derivatives, the Anglo-Saxon way, whereas the Federal Financial Market Service wanted simply to change the civil code, the existing civil code, the so-called German way. So the Bank of Russia had more authority and still has more authority and power than the newly established Federal Financial Market Service, and yet it failed to make and implement the law it was promoting. So this happened for the number of reasons, but one of the most important one, from my point of view, was the civil code itself. The Russian legal system is a system of codified law, which means that the civil code is the epitome of it, which means that the legal experts that guard the coherence and the systematic character of the Russian law, they weren't able to adopt the abstract terms that describe derivatives in this comprehensive big law on derivatives. So these terms simply didn't exist in this organism called Russian law, and the civil code as a very core of it. So here's another insight of science and technology studies proved to be true. Objects do matter, and anything that does modify state of affairs by making a difference is an actor. So the final and overall arguments I'm going to make here is that the term materials means manifold technicalities in a wider sense, including legal procedures, legal text, and legal cultures, as well as technological equipment. So local legal culture vastly affects financial markets, for example, by differentiating between gambling and sound financial activities. Also, the tiny legal technicality can have quite an obvious global, very material results, the most recent current crisis. And it also makes derivatives either disappear or reappear back into the material existence. So the legal text is a part of a machinery, a very particular machinery that produces the materiality of similarly virtual financial markets. That's it. Thanks very much for your attention.
Well, we have a very specific case and quite a lot of time for discussion, so who would like to join first? Okay, Victor.
So thank you so much for this presentation. And when Donald Mackenzie analyzes the reason ocean market crisis, the causes of ocean market crisis, if I remember correctly, he used to point to Schultz-Merton-Black equation as one of the reasons. As soon as many people started to use this formula for calculating the ocean prices, it led to proliferation of this formula, it led to homogenization of the very procedure of calculation, and as a result, prices of this particular market. Can we find something like this in the case of Russian GKO crisis 1998? Because in Mackenzie's case, it can show the correlation between the calculation techniques that we use and the results, sometimes quite forwarding results, 10-15 years. And in your case, can you show, for example, what kind of calculation techniques were used in the 1990s, the beginning of emerging GKO markets? Because now it looks like there's a legal machinery, which is a legal text which is part of machinery, but is there some calculation techniques that also are part of machinery can be distinctively analyzed?
All right. Well, I'm not a big expert on GKO market in a way that I have no idea how they calculate, for example, the interest rate on that. But I think logic is pretty straightforward, because the Russian government had to find the money to finance the budget at that time. So, and to be able to do so, they have to borrow and borrow more and borrow more. And that's why the interest rate went up, and basically that's what's exactly happening, you know, in Eurozone at the moment, in Italy, etc., with the Greek crisis as well. So you have to pay high interest for borrowing money. So that was the very straightforward calculation as such. So, but as I said, the story that fascinates me most, that it's not actually the GKO that produced this enormous amount of losses, large volumes of losses, and that actually triggered this very specific process that ended up in, you know, if you see this chain, ended up in having this most recent financial crisis. It's about forward markets, and that's exactly why I've decided to investigate how it all happens at that moment. So GKO is actually just the part of that, but not really the most interesting and fascinating part from my point of view.
I think both presentations were exemplary STS. I've detected a little bit of people trying to say they're not STS in this meeting, and just want to reassure everyone Svetlana in particular is exemplary STS. And particularly by that I mean that both of you follow that basic STS commitment to go right into the technical details of the formulae, of the currency derivatives and so on, and try to show that they are not economic, just technical and so on and so forth. But I wonder whether in doing that one misses what for me is one of the key economic issues of the day. And for me, one of the key economic issues of the day is how come so few people understand what the hell is going on in the global collapse of capitalism and the economic system. And I wonder whether STS of any kind, whether STS of your kinds, can explain that disjunction between the discussions which go on all the time in the political and economic sphere and the complete non-comprehension by people like myself and I think many others listening to what's going on. In other major political issues like should the West go to war in Iraq, should we protest about the collapse of public support for various kinds of services. There seems to be a clear agenda which everyone can lock into and engage with. But for some reason there seems to be some curious disjunction in trying to explain what the hell is going on. Do you have any comments on that? It's really for both of you.
Is that not exactly what's happening with the natural sciences? It's the authority of the expertise. So it just resulted in this complete miscomprehension of what's happening, because the idea of trusting people who work at the banks because they know better, that's actually the same happening just now with the idea of how do we fix the whole thing. For example, when we trusted the bankers thinking that they are the clever ones, they know what they're doing, right? We trust them our money. So now the trust was completely destroyed. Now we decided to do the same thing, to trust those guys who make regulations in the bank, saying, so do something. We have to make tough regulation or do something in terms of regulating this market. But it's the same type of the trust that we decided to transfer from the bankers to the regulators instead of, I don't know, perhaps maybe start public debates on that, trying to educate or trying to explain, well, educate sounds a bit patronizing, but explain people that it's not rocket science, it's not even sociology, it's pretty straightforward in a way that there's some logic, inner logic in how it works. So if we all know what's happening around, and especially if we depend so much on that, so why not to perhaps, kind of proliferate this knowledge? Is that possible? I'm not sure actually. Is that possible? Is it just a utopian project?
Well, no, but Michelle wants to add a question, I guess, rather than answer. Yeah.
It's another question.
What's really fascinating is that I think we managed trying to opening up the economics black box is much more difficult than opening up the sciences black box. Because it's such a convention that just open it up and just realize that there are lots of things that come naturally. So what's interesting, what I would find interesting in your question is why do people need to be so worried about the economy? Why did we? So that's the sort of the mirror to your question. Why did people get so interested in the economy in the first place? Why don't we just do that as a technical thing? Why do we make it such a big thing? Why did we end up making it such a big thing? Regardless of the crisis. I think regardless of the crisis. Why do we create the economy into this thing that our lives should basically rotate around?
Why do we? Why do we then? Tell us.
No, I think we do because there's a whole industry of people who actually want us to think that becoming experts in investment, which means actually delegating, we just enough interested that we want to put our money into a bank, but we delegate where the money is invested to experts is the way to go. It's just amazing that we are targeted. I don't know if it's in England, but in the US, I listen to every order there and offer for $100,000 product. I'm becoming I'm begging to
But are you saying there's nothing to be worried about?
No, what I'm saying two things is, there's this huge industry that made us subject of the economic world. Subject and non-expert, the dual thing where you are brought into it and simultaneously you are told, that's your future, you deal with it, but do not actually deal with that, just delegate it to someone who is an expert. And then, so the simultaneous move is, there is an expert, and there is a hard sense of how to manage your assets. So these are the two moves where you are brought into it, you are actually deprived any say to the way it goes.
Well, actually, we have enough time to let Michelle start a whole new type of argumentation, but I wanted to finish with this first, because suddenly Vincent was called to answer for Svetlana. And for me, the question is the difference between the two arguments presented in front of us. That is, if I had to represent what Vincent was saying in a very primitive way, is that models matter, particularly mathematics, which was completely unaccounted for. Well, what Svetlana seems to be saying is that legal formulations are more important in performing the markets. So am I grasping the difference right? Or Svetlana, please comment.
I wouldn't say they're more important, but the results of what's happening when some particular piece of legislation is applied to a particular contract is more kind of immediate and more, perhaps it's easier to figure out what's going on by discovering this chain of events and to see how one thing leads to another. But about the models, I would assume that it's pretty much the same idea, so how they spread and how they may perform the market in a way that through simple, for example, Donald Mackenzie argued that simple imitation, actually that's what makes modeling come to life as well. So somebody come up with a particular financial model and then people just imitating, seeing the success of this model applied to a particular trade. So imitation, so what I'm trying to say that I cannot really, why there should be some sort of juxtaposition between those two. I think it's, as I said, the material essence of the market in the application of the models and the figuring out how to work with them. In imitation, also it doesn't sound too materialistic. In legal technicalities, in all these things, as well as technological equipment. So these manifold technicalities and different way of thinking and cognitive kind of models. These are all come to these things that we think quite detached and just living on their own somewhere up there, and we depend on them really, really much. So in fact, these are pretty straightforward things if we start looking into them to see how they work. So it's not, I think it's something doable, yeah.
Okay. Well, Michelle had a different strand of argument, so why don't you?
Well, first I want to add something to what has been said about the explanation or lack of understanding of what is going on, drawing on a field that I don't know, but it happens that my husband Frank Dobbin works on this. And from what he tells me, it seems that the industry of greed is extremely efficient in producing obscuranticism when it comes to this, in part because there's a motivation for tax evasion, which hides a lot of the mechanisms that are going on, because the speculators are creating all kinds of devices that involves, for instance, trading at 11:50 on December 31st to make sure that tax will not be paid. So I think there are many mechanisms that are kept. The accountants in the room, the accounting engineers will tell us that the unbelievable creativity that is deployed by people who make a living making money. And I think both law and the creation of models are crucial for this. So I think it's not randomly that it's an industry that is largely based on secret. But here I'm reporting secondhand. And I think we cannot underplay this as a reason why it is so difficult for so many people to understand what is going on. On the other hand, I know that in American academia, conferences happen every day or every week about trying to explain what's happened, and many people are trying to poke holes in the secrets more or less successfully. So this is what I see as an outsider, surround people as someone who's surrounded by many economic sociologists to try to make a living, showing that the emperor has no clothes in some fashion. But the point I wanted to raise is really about your last slide, about materiality includes technicality. And one thing I'm always very puzzled when it comes to the material world, or the material term in STS, is really about the meaning of materiality. I mean, why would materiality include technicality and not vice versa? Is it like the leftover of Marxism in the way that the material is defined as determinant in the last instance? Why wouldn't technicality be determinant in the last instance? And if I think of Karen Norcitino's work on machinery or techniques of as the groundings of new kinds of epistemology, I'm always puzzled about why is it that one is given precedence over the other. So I simply would like you to comment on this point. First, why would materiality include technicality and not vice versa? Why are people talking about the material turn and not the technical turn?
Well, because the argument I'm trying to make is that the main thing is when it comes to think about derivatives market in particular, I'm not talking about all financial markets in its entirety. The derivatives markets seem to be particularly virtual in this sense. So they're everywhere and they're nowhere. So that's the whole point. So just even in the social studies of finance research, there is this idea of derivatives being highly virtual. It's new money, imagery and all these kind of terms. So to say quite the opposite, perhaps the most appropriate term would be to make these derivatives being material, something we can touch, something we can understand, something we can develop, or something we can develop our understanding of, etc. So in this sense, I wouldn't juxtapose these things as these two terms, technicality and materiality, because perhaps it's just in this particular application, technicality is pretty much the same term as materiality, and I can use them interchangeably in this sense. So I wouldn't say that there is a clear line conceptual line between these terms, and now we have to understand how they interplay with each other and why first, not second, etc. So, does it answer your question? No.
I just remain very positive that in reality. I mean, it seems to me if anything, a derivative or like a technical device. So why want to squeeze them into materiality? I just not sure I understand, but it can be my problem.
As I said, just for the sake of an argument, to say that it's not virtual, it's material, technical, comma technical. That's sort of idea in this particular argument. But you can say it's technical and doesn't matter really.
Is technical virtual or is technical material? I guess that was one other question.
Oh dear.
No, because we look at the screen and we kind of we're startled.
It's technical.
There's too many interdependent concepts.
Or technical could simply be information. It's a setup, right?
We shouldn't be actually monopolizing.
Can I ask you something about the slide where you're scaling? The mortgage situation in the US predates the early 2000s. I mean, it's basically the tragedy of the US for the last 30 years. So why do we do that? So is this just a way of saying that really thing, the fact that the Russian code internet space called, it's not good for the false all the way down to West Union to start having.
I see. Yeah, absolutely.
My place and Michelle place, the business people in the US, they will kill you for it.
I know. Well, the thing is, to be able to produce this logical chain, from the application of this particular article in the civil code to the very last kind of the part of this chain, I've done that just for a beauty of it. Because obviously that's not how we would explain what happened a few years ago. And that would be completely, dilettante way of explaining, a very simplifying way, and the wrong way, more. So what I'm trying to do here is not to explain what happened back in 1998. I'm trying to set up some sort of a logic of thinking, how we can see how all things are interconnected. For example, if we look at this particular application of Russian civil code, this also made some sort of impact in the whole chain of events. That's why I kept peddling this word, the chain of events, important role, the role in the chain of events, rather than causing the whole thing. So it's just, if you imagine the idea of thinking about the financial crisis as the whole webs of different chains that caused one another, right? So this is a tiny, kind of zooming out, this is a tiny chain that could be also considered that, made some sort of, caused some sort of particular events that led to what happened a few years ago. So it's not really something that like a sweeping explanation of what happened. Obviously, that would be completely disastrous way to say. It's just one of the things that we can nicely argue how this worked into that, rather than trying to explain the whole thing through the Russian financial crisis and the application of this article. No, absolutely. It's just the beauty of the arguments to see how all comes nicely together into the global financial crisis.
Okay, so it's not the main factor, but one of the myriad factors which contribute to this.
So the reason why I asked the question is because one of the main weaknesses of
one of the main weaknesses of That's good.
STS applied to finance is time to actually reach out to people who are not willing to engage deeply with their at home, is to actually show them that we want to be able to measure that, the impact of artifacts or rules of law on the transformation of markets. And the problem is that the bar is set very, not very high, but it's a different, different ways of thinking about markets when you talk to people in business schools. But many of them would be interested in that, on the way they so that's why I'm waiting to see people who do sort of finance to actually engage with the data. And I don't think that's so much, but that's very interesting to see how you can reach out to people who are much more number-driven.
Thank you. I have our economics professor Maxim Buev, who is also a specialist on derivatives in the Royal Bank of Scotland, who wants to produce another question. But you guys have to change places then. Можно ему дам микрофон? Thank you. And then we go on for lunch after this.
Yeah, it's
after this difficult question.
Not a question. It's actually I'm going to help Sveta with a couple of things. I think it's a brilliant slide. Actually, I saw something similar produced by Robert Peston, who's economics editor of the BBC website about 3 years ago. The timeline is very good, and it's maybe not particularly detailed, but answering Victor's question about blaming Black-Scholes formula is actually absolutely wrong. Because I mean, I don't know. I'm not obviously. I haven't read McKinsey, but Black-Scholes formula is still used in practices like starting point for all the traders and like a way of looking at the market. But what happened with the LTCM hedge fund is basically, well, one of the traders was betting on dollar-yen exchange rate that would be stable, and then Kobe earthquake happened, and basically many investors started bringing funds back into Japan, and the Japanese yen, as opposed to US dollar, the exchange rate moved, and nobody expected that. That's why they basically crashed. And you can't predict it with Black-Scholes formula, because it's like, how can you predict the earthquake? What happened with, on the other hand, what happened in Russia, basically 1997 was the year when several crises happened in Southeast Asia, and then investors like across the world, they started being like jittery about keeping funds in emerging markets, and then they started withdrawing funds from the Russian market, and unfortunately there was no functioning tax police in our country, and they couldn't literally, well, the government couldn't borrow, they couldn't roll over the government funding and borrowing, and they couldn't collect taxes, and they had to default. That's what happened. So it was not a question of mispricing. With LTCM, it was a question of mispricing, but not because of Black-Scholes, but because one of Black Swan, if you want to speak in terms of, what's his name, Nassim Taleb language. And another comment I had about what you said about your last slides, about maybe the previous discussion about, well, technicality, materiality. I'll give you an example of how I understand it. Maybe it's not particularly a good example, but still. There is this technology of prediction markets. I don't know if you heard about it. So basically, a speculative market where you can trade literally every type of contract, like if Putin stays as a president, or like what's the probability, whatever. And like when you look at the prices in those markets, you literally can, using mathematical apparatus, you can extract the probability distribution of a particular thing happening. And some people believe that that probability distribution will be truer than probability distribution that opinion polls generate, for example. And as I said, like you can trade literally any type of contract in those prediction markets. And what those markets started, they started actually in Iowa University a few years back. And some people were trading contracts like what's the probability of the next huge terrorist attack happening in New York. And for moral grounds, like many people always thought that it's wrong to trade those type of contracts. Or like what's the probability of the US president being killed like within the next 6 months or something. And that's why basically the government stepped in and basically said you can't just organize those type of markets. And for example, prediction market, the most recent one, around the Harvard actually, on Nobel Prize winners was closed just two days before the Nobel week because, well, it was illegal basically. It is illegal in the States. And it's exactly where literally for some reason, but still you can run those markets in Ireland, for example, because there are no regulations. And this is where those technicalities that I understand, like regulations, to say you can form this market in Ireland but not in the US. And in Ireland you can trade literally, well, wider range of derivatives. Technically the same derivatives as you potentially can trade in the US, but in the US, well, those markets, roughly speaking, thought to be the wrong device to have. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment.